everyone. All right, y'all, let's try it again. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you. That was a beautiful chorus. Anyway, welcome, welcome, welcome. For those of you who are new, welcome to the People's Forum. We're a space for political education, cultural work, essentially where all the cool kids come together who are struggling together for a better future. So if this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. We hope to see you again. So I'm really honored to open up this book talk. This is really important and crucial work. You know, when we think of scientists as knowledge producers and workers that have really changed a lot of our society. I think back to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we were all waiting for a glimmer of hope in the vaccine. And who are the people that were creating the work, that were in the labs, who were doing the work to make this possible? Scientists. So I'm really excited for this book and this discussion with these amazing panelists. So I'm glad you're all here, and we hope to see you again soon. So I'm going to pass it over to our comrade, Vasiki.
Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone who's here. This is a really exciting time for all of us. I know that we're all eager to have this conversation, so we're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to introduce Science for the People as an organization first. So we were active between 1969 up until 1989, and then revived again in 2018 as a publication. We're also an activist organization of scientists, educators, writers, and artists who are committed to the radical and democratic transformation of science and society for the benefit of humanity and the planet. So today we're going to be discussing this collection of essays by labor organizers in higher education, which have been collected into this book called Organize the Lab. It's available digitally, and it's also available in print, as you can see. You've probably already walked in and noticed that there are a few copies on sale through 1804, so if you haven't picked yours up already, please make sure that you do so. Science for the People is also a publication, and we put out 3 issues of the print magazine every year. So if you sign up as a subscriber, it's a great way to stay plugged in to how radical scientists understand and aim to transform our world. So without any further delay, I'm going to just introduce the panelists for today's events. I know that in all the promotional materials and the sign-up links, we were keeping it really on the down and low, but I'm really happy to share that all the people here are contributors to the book or organizers through Science for the People. And a lot of people that we are speaking to directly today live and work and organize in New York City or in the greater New York City area. So we'll go through in the sequence of the panelists as you see them seated. So we have Paul Brown here, who's a steward with the Student Workers of Columbia, SWC UAW Local 2710, and doctoral student worker in the chemistry department at Columbia University. When he's not organizing, he uses spectroscopic techniques to study energy transport in materials for sustainable technology applications. Iraj Eshgi is currently working towards his PhD in theoretical biophysics at New York University. Besides uncovering the physical underpinnings of life, he is dedicated to dismantling the systems of injustice imposed on us all. He has been an organizer with NYU GSOC, as well as the current efforts to unionize researchers on campus. Trent McDonald is a New Jersey-based staff organizer with Rutgers AAUP-AFT, a member of the Interim Steering Committee for Higher Ed Labor United, and a past worker organizer in the WashU Undergraduate and Graduate Workers Union. T.A. Tran is an editor of Science for the People, a scholar of social movements and political repression, an adjunct professor of political science at Baruch College. Outside of nerddom, they, she, he, whatever, I don't care, has been spotted in the wilds organizing alongside Seattle's low-waged and hospitality workers through the Fight for 15 and Unite Here Local 8, as well as managing Kshama Sawant's grassroots Seattle City Council campaign. In San Francisco, she organized with the Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. And here in New York, she served as the grievance counselor and vice chair of the CUNY Graduate School chapter of the PSC AFT Local 2334, where she focused on the struggle for adjunct rights and was part of the first ever effort to develop a union stronghold among grad workers in the natural sciences. Very pertinent to the conversation today. Presently, she's completing that little thing called the dissertation and therefore contributes nothing useful to the revolution. I beg to differ because you're here with us today. I'm Vasiki Chauhan, the publisher of Science for the People and a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Neuroscience and Behavior at Barnard College. So I'm going to pass it on to the panelists now to say a few words about what brought them into this struggle, what made them contribute to this book, and where they're at right now. But before I do that, I do want to say that we want this to be an audience-led discussion. So I'm going to get us all started and get the juices flowing by asking a couple of questions that I really couldn't help but think of as I was reading the book and editing it myself. But we will move on very quickly to an audience-led Q&A, and how we want to do this is maybe take 2 questions and comments from the live audience, take 1 from the online audience, if there are any, and then we'll have the panelists respond to whatever spoke the most to them. So stay tuned for that part of the discussion, because I really want to hear today what brought you all into this conversation with us. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Paul to talk a little bit about his organizing.
Yes, thank you so much. So again, my name is Paul. I am actually pretty new to both organizing and grad school. I'm in my 2nd year, and I sort of came in right place, right time, because the Columbia University Student Works of Columbia strike, they voted down. They had a historic no vote of a tentative agreement, right soon after my virtual visit week, basically. And so I was following from afar for a while, and I knew that I was going to get involved. I didn't quite anticipate how involved I would end up getting, but maybe everybody here can also feel similar about that. But I came in at the perfect time, early, just a month after I started is when they had the strike authorization vote for what became our 10-week strike. And it was just an extremely mobilizing experience. It's kind of interesting. I feel in a lot of ways the most important thing I'll do in grad school I've already done. But it's been a great experience, a really sort of radicalizing and truly inspiring experience. And so we were sort of contacted by, I think, Joe, basically someone who organized with Science for the People after our strike, who invited us who told us about sort of Science for the People's STEM organizing special, and invited us to contribute something. And so some of my co-workers and co-organizers in science and I decided to come together and try to put together just a piece kind of capturing our optimism and our feelings about what happened. I mean, if people don't know, but we went on strike for 10 weeks against Columbia University and basically won almost all of each of our 4 major demands, and including really historic non-economic demands like full recognition for all student workers and access to completely neutral arbitration for discrimination and harassment. And so we sort of just wanted to capture that. I mean, if you've read our piece, it's a very broad, sweeping piece, but I think it just captures the crazy feelings of optimism and hope that we were feeling. And I think we hoped that, and still hope that it will sort of serve to instill some optimism and hope in people, because labor organizing and any sort of radical left push for a better world there's not enough success stories, unfortunately, out there. And sometimes it can feel like there's not enough hope. And so we sort of were really looking forward to and hoping that our story can help sort of fight, I guess, push back against the despair that people too often feel, just given the conditions of the world right now. And so it was really exciting, and I was really honestly floored to read all of the other pieces too, and so I'm excited for this discussion tonight as well.
Thanks, Paul. Is this working? Okay. Hey everyone, I'm Iraj. Unlike Paul, I'm not in my 2nd year. I'm just about to graduate. So this is, for me, was kind of a post-mortem of my whole grad school organizing career, I guess. But more than anything, it was this article and kind of working on this book, for me, was a way of kind of processing everything that happened in 2020, 2021 at NYU. It was kind of a ridiculous year because, I mean, it was a ridiculous time for everybody. But on top of that, we were undergoing kind of this big strike that we had, right? We were renegotiating our contract, and at the same time, New York City was almost entirely on fire because of everything that was happening over the summer. And so what I was kind of trying to get across in the article was mostly kind of, there was kind of this two-sided thing that was happening where we were organizing for the union within campus, right? And so that was this very like well planned out, well understood kind of like labor struggle, right? And then culturally, like within our department, I'm in the physics department at NYU, there was this kind of immense internal upsurge of anger, right? Everyone was just really frustrated at the situation, and you know, with the George Floyd protests happening and our department being all white people and everything, everyone was just really upset, and no one really knew what to do. And so there were these two organizing paths that were happening at the same time. One of them was very successful. Our union organized a strike. Within a couple of weeks, NYU buckled and gave us kind of everything we wanted because strikes work. And then on the other side, we fought and fought within our department for months and months. And essentially all we got out of it was forever hating the faculty in the department and them forever hating us. And so it was kind of this important lesson about like, yeah, kind of strategy, right? Like what you gain, what kinds of approaches you can gain the most from. And specifically right now in STEM academia, I think the lesson I learned in 2021 was that, I mean, if you read the article, I think it'll come across pretty clearly, is that we need to be antagonistic towards the academy. We need to hit them where it hurts, which is their bottom line, because they've become essentially private corporations. And trying to like play nice with them doesn't work. And also they don't actually care about us. So yeah, so that was all of that. And then secondly, I also, one of the big things that happened at the end of the strike, because of how burnt out everybody was, because of, you know, doing a strike over Zoom is just crazy. And at the end of the 2021 school, I guess, spring semester, essentially all of the GSOC organizers like melted away. The union kind of, we won this contract and then everybody left. And there was this new generation that came up. But I kind of had this impression that all this knowledge that we had gained over the course of those years was going to be lost, right? So I felt like this book and this article would be a really important way to like write these lessons down, especially for, I think, yeah, organizing within the sciences was a particularly precarious time because, you know, there's just not that many people who are interested in doing it. So yeah, so historical document, me processing my feelings. So yeah, I feel good about it.
Pass me the book. Hi everyone. Oh, a little loud there. Hi. Yeah, so I'm Trent McDonald. To Vasiki's question of how I got my start organizing, I am a third-gen Appalachian unionist, but certainly not from a sort of hard-fighting Harlan County-minded bloody Cold Wars, more in the building trades, a little slower pace. Nevertheless, when starting grad school at Washington University in St. Louis, due to the work of the Student Workers of Columbia to drastically change the legal precedent to say you do have a narrow, very difficult, tall path toward getting a recognized union, you know, a sort of widespread wave emerged, right? And for scholars of social movements, which we have the great luxury of hearing from one after me, right? The sort of wave theory of change, right, is one that a lot of people talk about. It's among the most moving things to realize these are ordinary people just like me. They can fight and win, and so I can too. And I'm not just fighting for myself, I'm fighting for myself and my coworkers. Because a lot of times you're not even that angry about how you're treated, you just sort of learn to accept it. We just go along to get along, right? But when you see your coworkers treated like shit, that's what really changes things. One of my let's say, disagreements with sort of the received wisdom is often the boss is the best organizer. If the boss is the best organizer, capitalism wouldn't exist, right? We would all be thoroughly organized. The boss is, however, the best radicalizer. And so my first sort of campaign was organizing across job titles, housekeepers, food service workers, physicists, English folks, historians, to work to raise the minimum wage at the second biggest employer in St. Louis, Washington University. And we did. And that then moved our local healthcare system to do the same. And so that was about 5,000 workers with also then St. Louis University going up to $15 an hour, about $20 million per year in wage raises in a very conservative state, in a very conservative city. It's not New York, right? Learning, however, that the sort of necessity of doing broad-based organizing and seeing the lessons of Columbia, the lessons of Rutgers, where I am now, or University of California, whatever, it was really shocking that everyone always complains that it's really hard to organize in STEM. You've all heard it, right? I'd like to know my audience, who has read the book? Show of hands. Okay, well, buy the book, everybody read it. We all worked really hard on it. And particular note of appreciation to the People's Forum for having us and SFTP for the wonderful job editing, the beautiful design. There's some charts. You all love charts, right? I mean, your science, look at this. It's an umbrella chart. It's beautiful, right? My piece in particular, co-written with the wonderful Jewel Thomas-Sula, that founding president of the Georgetown Alliance of Graduate Employees, or GAGE, is called STEM Organizing in Waves, a macro and micro view. And so it intermixes a sort of personal history, particularly for Jewel, doing just the ardent, on the ground, have conversation after conversation after conversation, fight on issue after issue after issue of organizing biology, those so-called conservative STEM workers, and then also a deeper view, a longer view of various STEM worker upsurges that have usually been inspired by other workers organizing and realizing I'm an ordinary person, they're an ordinary person, together we can fight and we can win. We all have issues. We're not doing anything to solve them, so how do we do that? And so in particular, it goes to the 1930s to look at the Federation of Architects, Engineers, Chemists, and Technicians, a wonderful, catchy name, yes, fact, who were a sort of left-led, socialist, communist, whatever kind of union that believed in boycotts and strikes to desegregate hotels, as well as move the federal government to help pass the Federal Housing Act of 1937, I think is the year, that they said, we have out-of-work architects and engineers, we got to put them to work, and we want to put them to work for the common good, for the social good. And so a lot of the public housing here in New York was designed and built with union labor. So as you're walking around, think about that, right? That we could be doing really integrated organizing focused on associational power, right? It's not just about who you're bringing of your coworkers into the struggle, but also the community, the entire supply chain, the entire labor system. FACT, unfortunately, was largely red-baited out of existence. And so when there was this moment of going from 500 members to 6,000 in about a year, they only had a pretty short existence. Nevertheless, were very successful in that existence. And they eventually merged into a union called District 65, which is also where UAW Local 2110, that is who initially helped do a lot of the organizing. It was largely worker-led, of course, but helped with some of the organizing for the student workers of Columbia. And so that history of radical chemists lives on in Paul, right? Among others. The next little vignette in the piece, STEM Organizing in Waves, is about Boeing engineers. At the turn of the millennium, they went on a 40-day strike, some 20,000 something engineers. This is something that's like no one talks about anymore. But 40 days out on the picket line were these engineers. And what did they chant? No nerds, no birds. Not as militant, maybe, as one would hope, but it shows again that worker self-organization is what it's all about, right? The machinists working the assembly line had struck Boeing many times. And those unions have clauses in their contract that you have to cross the picket line under disciplinary penalty. That's a good clause, right? And so the engineers had to cross the machinist picket line. The machinists had to cross the engineers picket line. Nevertheless, they started to build up solidarity and respect and understanding that, oh, okay, we are all in this together, even if it's not perfect, right? They then went on to unionize 4,500 engineers in the radical leftist hotbed of Wichita, Kansas, one of the largest NLRB election wins. Everybody knows how hard those fights are, right? Amazon Labor Union, Starbucks Workers United. And then it stopped again. The machinists tried to unionize more white-collar Boeing workers, 17,000, and failed drastically. And so this turn of the millennium upsurge was quite brief, but nevertheless, Seattle to Wichita. That doesn't happen without the sort of wave model of organizing, of people believing those engineers can strike and have a strong union. We want to be a part of that union too. The final piece then is about this wonderful, extraordinary upsurge in STEM organizing. And though this was a labor of love, it went on for a very long time to produce this wonderful booklet. It's in some ways I wish we'd had sort of 2 more months to bring in the wonderful strikes that are happening right now. University of Illinois Chicago faculty, New School adjunct faculty, and of course, the one that everyone on Twitter talks about, the University of California. And so there's been just really fascinating discussions of what does it mean to build the disruptive capacity in STEM. It's not like manufacturing where you shut off the assembly line, nothing gets produced, there's your power. In higher ed, the bill is largely already paid, sometimes years ago when it comes to grants, and then at the start of the semester when it comes to the undergrad tuition for the teaching side, right? And so the long haul strike that Columbia, Harvard, NYU, and then UC did were often this kind of really fascinating test to try to disrupt the grant production model of you got to submit your reports, you got to do, I'm not a scientist, you pour chemicals together, whatever. When you stop doing that, eventually the financial hit happens. And it's largely been untested because of often a sort of labor bureaucratic belief that STEM is unorganizable. But it's never been unorganizable. It's just really freaking hard. But I imagine this is a fairly sympathetic audience to that argument that we can and we must organize STEM because it's the majority of higher ed and it's only going to keep growing. Final note, the piece that I co-wrote with Jewel and then this talk itself, I do always want to dedicate to my dear friend and comrade Colin Kluender, who was a biophysics grad who lost his life a few years ago. And so it's really important to always remember the old adage of don't mourn, organize. But we should mourn too, just often through organizing. That's all.
Hi, I'm TA. First off, thank you so much to the folks at Pupils Forum for maintaining this exquisite space and the wonderful programming that happens here. I also want to acknowledge the lives and the labor of the Munsee Lenape people who stewarded this land before it was colonized, and we're benefiting from that colonization here today, so that tension should really underlie our time together. I'm a bit of an odd one out in this panel. I mean, you can see it. But also, I hail from the social sciences. That's where I make my bed. And I did not write a chapter in this book. So what am I doing here? Well, I was asked to come on and be the bridge between STEM labor organizing and literally everything else under the sun. So totally manageable task in one evening. But I'll start by urging something that I think in theory we all know and we all agree with, but in practice we almost always push to the back burner. And that's this. STEM organizing, I believe, must, above all else, prioritize and center social justice unionism. And by social justice unionism, I mean a unionism that is not merely or even primarily concerned with raising wages, securing benefits, improving working conditions, handling grievances. By social justice unionism, I mean a unionism that centers solidarity above all else. Solidarity with the lowest waged workers, solidarity with the least privileged workers, solidarity with all of oppressed peoples in the global majority, and with non-human animals and the environment. I mean a social justice unionism that organizes alongside local frontline communities and makes global linkages. It's about using the strike power of scientists and engineers and teachers and nurses and doctors in order to advance agendas that are not set by us, but by the most marginalized among us and around us. And I think these principles are important for the labor movement in general, but it is especially important for STEM workers for the reason that labor and knowledge production coming out of STEM has been used, exploited, abused by big pharma, big agro, the military-industrial complex, empire itself, in order to cause some real harm and a whole lot of death to humans and non-human animals and ecosystems. So we know this, right? We know that STEM labor has been used to develop technologies of surveillance against political dissidents. It's been used for medical experimentation against Black and Indigenous communities. It's been used in order to patent and hoard life-saving seeds. It's been used to manufacture life-destroying weapons of war. So then that means, right, that the onus is upon us to do social justice unionism because our labor has been implicated in some really diabolical shit, both directly and indirectly, and I would say more so than basically any other discipline out there on the whole. So, you know, social justice unionism then means using our strike power, right, in order to end the system of for-profit science upon which all of these horrible things that I just listed are based. And this should be our main priority, not just about fighting for a good contract, but for fighting for an end to this system of for-profit science. I would say the other reason why it's really important for STEM workers, we have a special calling towards social justice unionism, is because we are relatively more privileged than other sectors of workers in this post-industrial capitalism landscape. And what I mean by that is that, you know, just think about in higher ed, STEM PhDs are much better funded than social science PhDs. And then when we graduate, right, STEM workers make 2.3 times more income than social science graduates. There's also the issue of STEM workers, you know, as much as we want to fight for more autonomy, STEM workers do have more autonomy in the workplace in general than other sectors of workers. Now, of course, when you're, you know, a POC STEM worker and you're queer and you're disabled, the situation becomes more complicated. But on the whole, STEM workers have class privilege and educational privilege and institutional access and institutional knowledge that is denied to, for instance, service sector workers. So I think this means that we have a responsibility to not just strike and organize for ourselves, but for the least structurally privileged, the most structurally marginalized. This could mean and again, to emphasize, this is not just about human communities, but it's also, for instance, trying to like bargain into contracts a commitment to social justice and to climate justice and to racial justice. I feel like everything that I've said is pretty obvious, but then again, if it was so obvious, then why are so few unions actually doing this, right? And so that is to say that it's actually really hard to do social justice unionism. There's always that competition that, like the concrete immediate issues, right, that we have to address as a union. There's also the issue of an entrenched union bureaucracy that is very much devoted to the model of service unionism as opposed to social justice unionism, right? It's all about contract bargaining. It's all about handling grievances, right? Rather than really being embedded in the community, being community facing, being globally rooted. But that's what I'm calling for. And this is exactly the sort of thing that actually makes a union really dynamic, is being so in touch with the community and the rest of the world that our members can't help but want to be involved in the life of the union. This is exactly what is required to inspire, right, more people to not only join the union, but to become really, really active in it. I also want to say that while it's really, really hard to do social justice unionism, there's a precedence for it, right, in the early US labor history. there's also precedence for it in STEM organizing. From what Trent said, we know that the earliest efforts to organize labor in STEM were very much about social justice. And we saw this during the Cold War, we saw it again during the Vietnam War, which is really what gave birth to Science for the People, right? Was this anti-war positioning. Scientists rejecting their labor being used in order to destroy lives in Vietnam. So, and again, we see this happening, with, for instance, all of the workers in Iran, the petrochemical workers, right? The doctors, the sugarcane workers, the shopkeepers who've gone on strike for women's rights, right? And to protest the crackdowns of the Iranian government against women, against anti-government protesters. So I guess the bottom line, right, is that I feel like, have a special calling to really revive this legacy of social justice unionism. And this happens in STEM. It must happen in STEM.
Thank you so much for all your comments. Like, so many polemics have been challenged in what you've all said here. And I wish I could ask new questions from the ones that I already shared with you, but that's why we have an audience. I feel like you've done a really good job both laying out the background of why organizing in STEM matters, what precedent we can use to adopt strategies to do that effectively, and also painting this vision of how we should be doing that. So thank you for doing that and sharing your lived experience in the process as well. So to open up this discussion aspect of what we're going to be doing today, I have 2 questions prepared. Don't feel like you have to go in order, just jump in with whatever speaks to you, and we can use that format going forward as well. So the first question is a little bit more about the strategy for organizing, given the models that we've seen existing in the world that we live in right now. I'm really curious about your thoughts on the strengths and weaknesses of organizing with established unions and union structures, or forming independent entities and coalitions. Relatedly, STEM and research more broadly is characterized by a lot of hierarchy, and who the boss is can often be a really elusive question. So I'm wondering what coalitions of unions you envision, and how they can be materialized. How can coalitions between student workers who are paying tuitions and adjunct professors who are trying to strike be built effectively within academia?
I guess I can start. I don't want to, any one of us up here could probably talk for 30 minutes on just this question alone. I think I'll just address the first part on established unions or independent. I think I've kind of had a unique experience with all of that. So I'll talk about an established union, because the question is, do you go with something that already exists, like one of these big national unions like the UAW, the Teamsters, the AFT or whatever, or do you form your own independent one like workers are doing at Trader Joe's or Amazon, ALU. And so for established unions, obviously I have been an organizer with an established union. I think it's helpful to think of the cons first, and I'll kind of talk about why I'm gonna address the drawbacks and weaknesses of this first. And the first, more kind of boring but true answer is you're not really fully in charge of your dues or bylaws. There's way less flexibility. For us, some percentage of our dues, we only get some percentage of our dues. I think it's about a third. 1/3 of our dues we keep as a local. The other third goes to the strike fund for the UAW. And then the other third goes to just the UAW's general kind of fund. Whereas if you're an independent union, you keep all of that. You are have full control over all those dues. And also there's way more flexibility in the bylaws and stuff like that. When we wrote the bylaws for our local, we had to kind of fit it within the existing structure of the UAW Constitution. The second weakness, which ties a little bit to what TA was saying, is a lot of these established unions have very entrenched cultures of like business unionism or service unionism, and like they at best have cultures of business unionism and service union, and at worst outright corruption. The UAW itself had like very public, horrible cases of corruption, like millions of dollars of embezzlement by leadership. Everybody on like the leadership team buying themselves Rolexes with union money. But even like at best, when it's not that level of corruption, it's just like a different mindset where I'll quote a former sort of organizer with the UAW around like the New York City area once had an organizer training where they said, quote, "The number one job of a union organizer is to manage workers' expectations," which I think betrays like the fundamental failure of imagination that I think categorizes most of the mindset of established unions nowadays, which is, well, like I mean, either through sort of like graft or just lack of vision, they just can't see anything better than slowly stemming the erosion of everybody's real wages. But now I'm going to talk about the pros and the strengths of an established union, which are basically resources. The strike pay and like the staff and the legal help and the logistics help that a established union can offer like can really make the difference sometimes. The difference between asking people to go on strike like and receive nothing versus go on strike and you receive like weekly strike pay still to help you just put food on the table is a huge difference in sort of how easy that is for people. And the reason I kind of bring that up is national unions really don't have to be as bad as they are. I think that's something that like we're seeing now with anybody who's sort of involved in the UAW right now knows that there's the election going on with the UAW where for the first time ever members actually directly elect their leadership. But so that's happening with like the UAWD caucus, but there's other reform caucuses like Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And these are sort of like fighting to reorient these national unions into like the fighting unions that they could be. Because if with the right mindset, this is just resources to help workers fight for what they deserve, but it just ends up being the wrong mindset where it's co-managing workers with the boss. And so we'll sort of see how that plays out with the UAW election. We'll see how that plays out with the Teamsters strike against, or potential strike against UPS this summer. Though it's worth noting that the last successful, the famous 1994 Teamsters strike, that was under TDU Reform Caucus leadership. And my own experience has been interesting because with the Student Works of Columbia, we voted down, there was a lot of interference with the sort of like UAW bureaucracy initially where people were like not identifying themselves as paid staff. People were like pressuring people into accepting a concessionary contract. But that contract was voted down and they kind of lost interest. And then when I came in, like my only interaction with the UAW was with the staff members that like were only there to help us, not pressure us. And so I feel like I had a experience with a minimally involved UAW that showed me that like how helpful a national union can be. It's just a matter of the sad reality is many of them don't have that mindset right now.
So yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I wanted to first of all second the last part of what you just said. When we were organizing the NYU strike, or everything around that, for years beforehand, we had been kind of preparing with this knowledge that UAW was going to maybe get in our way during the strike period. That's what this T-shirt is. So we have formed this caucus, or rather we formed this branch of a caucus called the Academic Workers for a Democratic Union, and we were fighting the UAW every step of the way. And kind of like what Paul just described, they quickly realized that like they couldn't really, force us to make decisions. their way. So then we ended up getting all the benefits of a national union, right? Like the free T-shirts and stuff. So there's that. But then I also wanted to get to a different part of your question, Vasiki, about the faculty or about the kind of coalitional organizing in STEM. I don't know what's going on. So one thing that I was very surprised by, and I wrote a little bit in the piece, was how non-cooperative faculty were during our unionizing efforts, right? I definitely thought that they would be like sympathetic, because they're coming from a position of, they love to complain about how terrible academia is, they're being paid much less than they probably should, they're having all the negative experiences that we're having. And yet both during our union organizing and also during the intra-departmental stuff that we did, trying to change science culture or whatever, they were extremely resistant, not just because they were afraid that, I don't know, we weren't gonna get work done or something, but pretty clearly because they were afraid that somehow like their privileged status was going to be hurt by our organizing, right? Like they didn't want unions to come in as this like third party to like mediate between us and them. They didn't want us to in any way gain any kind of like leverage within the university, right? And that was like, I found that super demoralizing. And I don't know, since then I've kind of like, I think the way, I mean, and you can think of this as maybe just like a really smart type of hierarchical structure by the university. The faculty, whether they're adjunct or they're clinical faculty or even tenured, are just like so insecure, and they've been like put under so much pressure to like get to where they are now that there's no desire to like open up any space for anybody else in their organizing, right? So yeah, coalitional organizing with faculty is just something I became a lot more pessimistic about. Although there's places like Rutgers where they've done that really well. So I don't know, maybe you need to start from a place where the faculty don't already have some kind of established position. I don't know. But anyway, that's all my thoughts on that.
Since Suraj gave us the shout out, I guess I should say, yeah, so I'm currently organizing with Rutgers AAUP-AFT, the union for all sort of faculty, grad workers, postdocs, librarians, and education opportunity fund counselors, about 9,000 right now statewide with various contracts and mergers afoot, bargaining a big system-wide contract. And it's an old union, it's 52 years old. It's one of the first faculty to unionize. The grads joined 2 years later, and it's only us and the City University of New York Professional Staff Congress that have the grads and the faculty together in one union. And so, like sort of craft unionism is unfortunately endemic in higher ed, that many campuses have 10 different unions, including at Rutgers, there's about 10 different unions. And so we often end up in these situations where, yeah, there are a lot of faculty that abuse and exploit the grads and lab techs and postdocs. And I'm sorry I left out postdocs. Arian Rutgers, AAUP-AFT, I'm the postdoc organizer. That was my mistake. Well, postdocs are great, love postdocs. And so, nevertheless, the faculty being shitty is a symptom of the higher education labor market, right? Is that, federal funding has been flat, and that's what we're campaigning. We've all heard that like line. That's not true, right? That most of the research universities are in extraordinary financial health, not just good, but extraordinary, right? They have the money for wage raises. But the grant-funded model of labs in fierce capitalistic competition with one another have made it so that the PIs, investigators, for those who don't know, usually tenure-track faculty, right, just have a market incentive to punish, to exploit, to overwork, right? And it's particularly toxic in STEM. I mean, of course, in humanities and social sciences, there's less money there, and it has its own issues. But that sort of one-to-one, top-down sort of brutality that often takes place in the lab, not in every lab by any means, but frequently, comes about because we're not actually fighting, or let me start over. That comes about because we're often fighting the tyranny of the boss. We assume Columbia management is the enemy. And they are, of course. They're not the biggest enemy, though. We have to be fighting the tyranny of the labor market, the one that's produced 75% of instruction being taught by adjunct faculty in this country nowadays, roughly. It shifts. By comparison's sake, that would be if 75% of K through 12 instruction was taught by substitute teachers. School board meetings would be riots if that were the case. And yet, of course, there aren't in higher ed. Why is that? Because we're so divided. Divided organizing, divided bargaining, that's weak. And so this is speaking to Vasiki's second question, right? And so at the end of the piece, again, buy the book, read the book, it's very good, talks about Higher Ed Labor United, a new multi-union coalition working to bring all the locals, organizing committees, minority unions, solidarity unions, however people are self-identifying their local organizing struggle to put that in national terms. Because we have to fight the tyranny of the market. That's the only thing that works. Small-scale craft unionism, even large-scale craft unionism, does not work. Only organizing grads. I'm a grad unionist to my core, but we can't do it on our own. There are gonna be faculty that are enemies. There's gonna be Columbia or NYU or Harvard or Rutgers, in particular, management that is the enemy. It is not the major enemy. And unless and until we understand that and develop strategies to it, we're not going to make the sort of gains necessary to turn higher ed around. The ship's been sinking for a while, right? It's still not at the bottom. It can and will get worse unless we do something about it.
So something that either Raj or Paul said, I now can't remember who it was, the idea that a union is a third party, right, coming in from the outside. And I think that's part of the problem, is that so many people view the union as that, because it has largely been like that because of how bureaucratized it is. And it doesn't feel organic, right, to the workers. And so one of the ways in which this kind of relates to Vasiki's question of independent affiliation or affiliating with a big union. I kind of want to have to take us all the way back in history, because Stott and Lynn makes an argument about the Wagner Act, or the otherwise known as the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, being a pivotal moment in terms of causing some trade-offs, right, for the labor movement. On the one hand, it gave us a legal recourse. It gave us something like being able to bargain, right, collectively bargain for a contract, and then having that contract be legally binding. On the other hand, it took power away from workers in other ways, because before that, workers, whenever there was like some issue that they had, they would just all go and get one another together and like do some sort of collective action against the boss and exert that pressure right there on the spot. It was direct action, it was organic, it was collective, always collective. And then with sort of this, like the legalization, right, of these processes that used to be sort of like who had most power on the shop floor. Now it's all about legalese, paper pushing. We need to file this grievance that this worker has an issue with, right? And we have to go through the bureaucratic channels and is this legal? Is that? There's hearings involved, right? All of these things that then become a trade-off for what kind of power do we want to exert, right? And I feel like, this model of sort of like the legalization of labor, it gave us certain guarantees, and it also took power away from us. And so how to get back that power? I think one of the ways that we can actually do that is through independent unions. They're not, like a silver bullet solution, but I would say that the things that they allow us to do is to think beyond this union bureaucracy, to, for instance, use grievance handling as not an opportunity to address a problem for one individual worker, but rather to think about how can we use an individual grievance to actually mobilize the collective around this grievance, so that everybody goes to bat for this one worker. And then the next time another worker has an issue, everybody else will go to bat for that worker. When I was a grievance counselor, it was, I never was able to actually do this. So this is aspirational. This is like me kind of reflecting back on how could grievance handling, something that's like such like a bureaucratized process, be actually part of the toolkit for workers to exercise their collective muscles, right? So there's that aspect. There's also the aspect of, I think, going independent allows a lot more union democracy. Union democracy is everything. And it allows you to really focus on not substituting union staffers for the collective power of the workers. It allows you to not substitute like a team of people who are going to be an expert bargaining team, right? That the union sent, right? Or the union trained. It's about people learning to do all of these things with one another for themselves. I think it's easy to be swayed by the resources that the big unions throw our way, but we can prepare ourselves to do without that. And by preparing ourselves, what I mean by that is really deepening our allies in the community, really deepening our ties to the community, deepening our connections to other unions, so that we don't need those resources because we have resources elsewhere that we can tap into, the community's resources. Last thing that I would say about going independent versus not is that I believe that being independently affiliated allows you to experiment a lot more with different types of organizing, different tactics and strategies. And the thing is that like that experimentation is exactly what is needed in order to win, because every workplace is a little bit different. Every struggle, every contract fight is just a little bit different in terms of the material conditions that you find yourself in, the power that you have, and the power that you can build in that moment. Those are the questions that you have to ask yourself, right? How much power do I have and how much can I build? And that is going to change over space and time. And that requires experimentation. But oftentimes my experience has been that the big unions have a certain way that they want things done. And so workers are then limited by that sort of like, by that practice, by the habits, right? That union has built up over time. And so the end goal, I think, is to make the union our union, like to be the union, as opposed to feeling like the union is something that exists outside of the workers, because that is what makes a dead union. So to make it alive would be to really make the workers feel like without them, there is absolutely no union. And to be an independent union is, I think, one of the best ways to achieve that.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of richness in your responses, and I feel like we're getting at the time where we've heard each other talk a lot. So maybe it would be nice to move on to audience questions. I'm going to throw mine in there in case you want to respond to it, because it essentially speaks to what TA said in her part of the discussion, which is about social justice unionism. My question is basically about how do we materialize that, right? Like, how do we make it happen? And I guess independent unions kind of get at that answer, but my experience in talking with labor organizers has been that it's often like when you're negotiating a contract, like all of the articles that have spoken about negotiating a contract have spoken about third-party arbitration for sexual harassment within academia, and also for like other kinds of discrimination. So it seems that it's basically these experiences that galvanize workers into taking on the role of organizers. Given that there's a clear connection between what drives one's own experience, their social justice orientation, and the propensity of the labor movement right now, like how do we sort of steer left flanks within existing unions to like take up social justice issues, respond more to like what's happening in the world right now? Like, how do we speak to what's happening with women's rights struggles in Iran? Like, how do we speak to what's around us and not just what was happening when we wrote our bylaws, right? So I'll just throw that out there, and I'm sure like things that I've been thinking about are going to come up in the questions that the audience brings forward. So if we can have Sadie with the mic, like we can take maybe one question from the live audience, one from online, if there is one.
If you'd like to ask a question, you can just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, I'm gonna have, yes.
individual in the right.
Hi. So yeah, thanks everyone for this fantastic talk. So yeah, I'm with postdocs at Columbia University UAW for 100. We are going into negotiations, and I think like one of the questions, it really, I feel offended when people think that STEM workers are conservative. In our opinion, like our majority membership, it's in STEM, biomed, medical campus. But I think like one of the big challenges when we are talking about, contract, it's that most of us don't feel that we have collective power. I mean, I think like it's that some speakers have talked about it, like, we have the grant money comes every year, if we strike, who cares? And kind of being able to convince our members that, like, we can do it together, it's, I would say, the biggest challenge for all of us. So I would really, would like to hear all your thoughts in terms of how you move someone to make them realize that we can do it.
So, can I try to answer that?
If we could just take one. Is there a question online for us already? So if you can just take one online and then maybe lump three together. Thank you.
Okay.
Someone says, Kyla says, how are these unions positioned to challenge funding streams for research? What work needs to be done?
So I'm going to try to answer both Vlasiki's second question and your question kind of at the same time. I think there's, and also it's kind of speaking to what TA was saying earlier, one of the kind of beautiful things about social justice unionism, or just unionizing like around these kinds of issues that like really make, get people worked up, right, is that it kind of does the radicalizing for you, right? I think one of the things that we found tremendously successful with GSOC was, I guess it's worth taking one small step back. At least my mentality going into all of this grad student organizing, all of this scientist organizing within academia was always kind of like, I don't, and this might be a bit controversial, I don't really think like academics are particularly like downtrodden, horribly oppressed class of people. I think it's really important for us to unionize and organize because academics have such like an outsized like cultural effect on society, right? And like if I can convince like 10 future important scientists that like, I don't know, Karl Marx was right about something, then like I'm going to have a huge effect in the future, right? So I feel like GSOC was kind of structured with this in mind from like the very beginning. Before my time even, they were doing social justice organizing around, one of the first big issues they organized around was Palestine solidarity, right? So they basically held this like union-wide vote to support BDS, and it was just like kind of this big controversial thing, and it kind of maybe haunted us for like the rest of our contract. But one of the things that happens when you do these things, when like the union takes a really strong stance on something like this, is suddenly a bunch of radicals will like start flocking, and you kind of like gain. Like when GSOC organized this BDS vote, suddenly a bunch of radicals joined the union and started helping with organizing. During the strike organizing, one of the big things we did, which was kind of the same idea, was we wanted to add a clause in our contract to kick cops off of campus, right? It was 2020, 2021. This seemed like an obvious thing to do. And so this was something that was kind of really hard to do because technically we really had no right to like put this in our contract. Like this is not something you usually can organize around. We argued it was like a health and safety issue, which it is. And eventually we actually won that, right? But so in the process of creating these social justice oriented clauses, you end up kind of activating people, right? So then you go around talking to scientists who are, like you just said, like kind of structurally made to be like not very organizable. They're siloed, their funding is kind of coming from very specific places, they're like literally physically in a lab, which you physically don't have access to, right? Like I think that's a big reason they're hard to organize, is you can't get into the labs, but you can get into the offices of like the sociology students or something. But if you suddenly like, they're, on the internet every day seeing that like, black people are being shot by cops all the time, and they see that like, oh, there's there's this union on my campus that's like wants to kick cops off of campus, that will that changes the picture. They don't think like, oh yeah, I don't really care about my wages, I just want to get this PhD and get out of here. Suddenly there's like an actual like moral good they can do by organizing this union. And I think it precisely showed how non-conservative scientists were, that like this kind of stuff was what was bringing them out. So anyway, yeah, the social justice stuff, it kind of just justifies itself when you do it. And just a tiny thing to add to that, I really think that that's something that's feasible under a big national union, as long as you proactively organize within the rank and file to like oppose the effects of the like bureaucratized leadership or whatever. It just, in an independent union, you wouldn't have to deal with that. But it's like you can make it work as long as you're very conscientious about it, I guess. So.
I'll speak briefly to Cora's question about how do we sort of convince postdocs or lab workers to sort of believe in themselves. This is more of like a only loosely tested hypothesis, to speak to the scientific rhetoric, right? That it does come about through people seeing other strikes happen. That we did just have the first ever, like to our knowledge, sort of wide-scale postdoc strike in hand with the grads at the University of California system. The other unions, didn't participate because their contracts aren't lined up, and so they would have been violating the no-strike clauses, exposing them to financial penalties, blah blah blah, right? And so, seeing, when the workers' inspiration when the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, right? It is there in that old song, "Solidarity Forever." How do you transmit that to people? Then how do you convince them? Right, comes about from just doing the really hard organizing conversation of asking someone, what does make you miserable about your job? And then providing a clear and concrete and credible plan to change that depends on their participation. And it's not a matter of like that you convince everyone, but it's that you convince a critical mass once you have enough conversations, once you build up enough of a layer of worker organizers within the rank and file, right? And so it's a matter of what you do with the resources you have, whether you're an independent union or affiliated with a large national union. Are you going to teach other people how to fight on the job, or are staff going to be the ones doing all that, right? And so here at Rutgers, just to give an example, we sort of ripped off the great organizer Jane McAlevy's strike school. And so now we've trained up hundreds of our members how to convince people to believe in that one, they believe in themselves as organizers, and two, you have to convince your other coworkers to believe in yourselves, right? And so we are doing a strike pledge right now. Rutgers people, if you're on Zoom, you need to pledge to strike. And tell your coworkers to, and ask them to. And so it's just repetition of deep, really intentional listening and intentional, clear, concrete, hard ass. It's the only thing that works.
So just to piggyback on what was just said about the contagion effect, essentially, right? That workers who see other workers succeeding, right, have a hope that they can also succeed. But that's not the only thing that diffuses. It's also like repertoires, framings, slogans, right? Messaging, images, these things that then can be utilized once you see it working in other spaces. But I was also thinking about a couple of other things in terms of like how can workers really start to feel their power. I think that it really starts from the really slow work of relationship building because once you, and I don't mean just like instrumentalizing relationships for the sake of organizing. I mean valuing relationship building in and of itself, because when workers feel invested in one another, when they feel like their friend is getting effed over by the boss, they're gonna show up for that person. And that individual issue becomes a collective issue immediately. And then when you are going to bat for your coworker, then those are little exercises of collective power that then build the confidence in workers, right? To keep exercising that collective power. Like, wow, I actually was able to like get something done here, right? By acting collectively. also, relationship building is exactly the type of thing that will sustain a movement, because this work is grueling and it is demoralizing. It is hard. You know, most of the time it is like Sisyphean. You're like rolling that big rock up the hill and it just keeps coming back down. And but you keep showing up because of your coworkers, because you love them, because of love and of solidarity with them, right? So I think that is why relationship building is sort of like the pinnacle of like sustainability and organizing, as well as helping workers to really feel collectively invested in one another. I also think that we need to talk about the role of students. And I don't mean student workers, right, in the union. I mean the students that we teach. These are probably one of the most underutilized allies that we have. For instance, whenever I, tell my students how much money I make, their heads literally explode, because they're like, it's like I might as well be working at McDonald's, to them. They can't believe how exploited I am as an adjunct professor. So, and they have networks, they have clubs, they have newspapers, right? All of these are resources that can be really helpful for labor organizing. And again, it's not just instrumentalizing those relationships and those networks, but rather it is part of what we're doing is that we're trying to create a better learning environment for the students. We're trying to make sure that that in us asking for higher wages at the bargaining table, that the school won't raise their tuition in order to pay for our raises, right? So we want everything for everybody, including our students, and they're our greatest allies. The last thing that I would say is to make use of political education, especially in STEM, because there is a tendency for STEM workers to think that their work is apolitical, but a political education as part of union activity can really help people to see how their labor that they're producing is being used, and to understand that underlying science is a fundamentally political and social process, right? And that it's implicated in empire and it's implicated in capitalism and in oppression. So I think that kind of political education it awakens class consciousness, and really, and the class consciousness comes with the idea of like collective agency, right? That would otherwise be lacking if you think that you're just like, if you're kind of more bought into the whole individualism thing, right? That tech culture and capitalism has all ingratiated in us.
Yeah, I think I'd like to try to just piggyback a little bit on what TA was saying and others have said, where like I think part of the thing is, everybody here, we look, and I work inside a university, so I think more in terms of that, but I think this is applicable to a lot of things. But we look at universities right now, which like claim to have this like socially uplifting sort of role and stuff, but clearly that's wrong. As like others have said, if we look at them, they've become financialized into like private corporations where the most important people seem to be like the board of trustees and the investment team, and the most important mission seems to be expanding endowment and like financial holdings. And so, if you envision unionism as just wages and benefits, like you will never change that. And so like this is where I think, social justice unionism, it's also like sometimes referred to as class struggle unionism as well. But it's like moving beyond the economics to like, how do we use our collective power to directly contest the dynamics of power that sort of govern our lives and make our lives so shitty and awful. And because also at the end of the day, like everything is interconnected. There's 1,000 quotes that are like, social issues are tied to economic issues and everything is tied together. And the conditions of all the people working at the university like are interconnected. And to also what Trent was saying, this is a great example as well, kind of what Tia was saying, that the Chicago Teachers Union have done this, where they call it like bargaining for the common good, where you realize that like, you know, you're not just bargaining for the teacher pay, you're bargaining for the experience, the learning experience and like social experience of these students in these impoverished, like completely forgotten Chicago neighborhoods. Because I also think it's important, like what Trent was saying, the most motivating thing with organizing people in science for our strike was not like pay, because ultimately, like Iraj was saying, we are the most privileged student workers at Columbia, the STEM workers. And so that was not as much of an issue, but it was like hearing about how social work PhD students made like something like $27,000 a year in New York City in like 2021. It's outrageous. Hearing about like sort of all these cases of discrimination, harassment that were swept under the rug, forcing people to like ask themselves, okay, if the university is so convinced of how fair its process is, why do they refuse to let a neutral third party take a look at it? And also inviting them to open bargaining and having them see for themselves like the demeaning way that the university would talk about like our coworkers and other workers at the university. And so like building those relationships, I really like what Tia was saying about that, building like a community, sort of bridging over, you know, American society and Western society, but mostly American society even most, is so atomized and isolated. And that's, I think, like a little bit by design. But if we can bridge past that, that's when we can like really find true power. And to also speak to the the online question, which I think is also relating to what Cora was asking about, like how do we sort of realize our collective power? I think a really eye-opening thing for me is part of the problem is so many STEM workers, especially like in academic settings, I think don't really see themselves as workers in the same way. But when you actually look at, like I don't know maybe everybody here already knows this, but I learned like through getting involved that there's this thing called indirect fees. And indirect fees are where every grant that our labor brings in, our research, and honestly, even like our PI's research to a lesser extent, well, maybe not the PI's research, but the PI's like grant writing work, our research labor, that brings in millions of dollars worth of grants, and the university can take up to 2/3 of that, just like straight to their own like operating funds. And if you look up you can look it up, first off, you can look up the rate. At Columbia, it's about 64% of grants goes straight to the university, and the faculty, the PIs are annoyed by that too. But if you look at the financial reports as well, you can see that's like hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for the university each year. And so one of the things, like Trent was sort of talking about, it's really interesting to see the UC strike, because again, it's like this is like the first time research workers really like went on strike in mass. You know, I'd love to say that the Columbia strike was fueled by like STEM workers. I think STEM workers played a hugely important part, but ultimately our highest leverage in the Columbia strike was with the teaching labor. And so the UC strike was really powerful to see all these STEM workers like walk out of the lab completely, like not do anything. And so I think that was really powerful and inspiring in a lot of ways. But in a lot of ways also, I think we can see that there were a lot of weaknesses to that. If you, like people who followed the discourse, there was like fear being the sort of agreement that they agreed to, which was very divisive. In part was agreed to because there was this like rampant fear that the strike could not go on like one day longer. Or that like maximum strike leverage had passed, which is, I think, kind of ridiculous because the highest leverage point of your strike is always tomorrow. But I think it's really interesting, and so I think this is still an open question of because obviously I like what Tia was saying too, our workplaces are different. Like the conditions of being a student worker in a lab at a university, at like a private university, are completely different than, I mean, not completely different, but like obviously not completely the same as being like a worker at a Starbucks, or like a worker or a facilities worker in an office, or like a factory worker. And organized labor, I think, really can't, like, I think it is sort of short-sighted to try to do a one-size-fits-all strategy. And so this is still an open question with how do STEM workers strike, and how do we like challenge those funding streams. But I think like amongst UC rank and file people, there was this vision, which is we did it in like a much smaller scale at Columbia, but I think the UC rank and file vision really was clarifying this, and I think something to sort of build off of for the future is if you can do the research to like feel protected for your own personal, so you don't get like failed out of the program, but you do not communicate any of that to the university or to your PI, for instance. Because then, ultimately I think the idea is the university doesn't care whether that much, the board of trustees don't care that much if like you're discovering this new like molecular conformation or something. They care when that brings in a grant. And so like we have to sort of think of new ways to strike directly at the ways that our work translates into profits for our employers. And we need to like rethink new ways. And so that's one of the ideas that the UC rank and file caucuses were talking about. And I think, obviously, again, still an open question, but I think that seems like a really promising approach.
We're going to open it up to the audience again, if someone, Calvin.
So what TA said really struck to me about political education and doing social justice unionism. And I want to concretize what the suggestion and ask the question, what role do organizations outside of the union, for example, like Science for the People or the Radicals or other radical science organizations, what role do they play in political education, for example, and also like helping connecting unions, and also how do we like have a unified vision of science that's not, that's not capitalist and build power through unions.
We can take a couple more questions from the audience before we pass it back to the panelists.
I'm gonna read one from online and then I got you.
Awesome.
All right, Anwesh says, what should an individual or a small group of sufficiently radicalized individuals in a lab do in order to organize in a place where the collective class awareness is low, even though the challenges faced are the same?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to, you have been talking about the unions and the independent unions and so forth. So what's going on in terms of confederation of perhaps these independent unions, particularly challenging and addressing some of the issues that you have raised that transcend the local interest of the particular interest of the community involved? So do you have some confederation, like for example, you have raised this idea of the minimum, but basically the pay rate for many of the students is established by the granting agencies. So actually maybe it is a direct target to just establish a minimum. NSF has some talking about that. NIH, nothing at all, and actually quite miserable when they talk. So that's one way to go about it. And also, with the broadening the federation or the confederation or whatever we want to call it, I think the community is also very well positioned for the international, appeal. Because basically, when you learn about the targeting, the goals of the funding agencies like NSF are kind of very nationalistic when knowledge and science and all of these ideas are quite international and human being. And perhaps it's a good timing as we are disempowered just like anybody else. So yeah, we are kind of privileged, but also disempowered, because nobody gives a damn about our wisdom.
I think we can start responding to whatever spoke to you.
Let me try to do some, oops, sorry. Is that all right? Yeah, some braiding across the couple questions there. So the question about what does the small group of organizing sort of committee do? And then what's the role of sort of radical STEM, institutionalized radical STEM. And so for starters, again, buy the book, Science for the People magazine, Organize the Lab. It's all in there. There are very practical skills by which you have to learn them in order to be effective organizers. You have to know how to have an organizing conversation. You have to know how to map a workplace. And we get a little bit of it right there on the cover, even, right? You don't even have to buy it, you can just look at it. But in short, you have to take the militant minority to make a militant majority, even if it's temporary. That strength in numbers is what's really paramount. And so the sort of radical, self-organized bodies, politicized bodies that already exist, one of the most important things is to act as a resource hub and a training ground for the people that want to fight but don't entirely know how to yet.
Yeah, I think talking to that point as well, I think is interesting because again, as we've sort of talked about, as everyone here has probably experienced, there is this idea that STEM workers have low class consciousness, I think was the way that the question was phrased or something. And I think one sort of thing is people if only there was a way that I could find the right combination of words to radicalize anybody, but I haven't found that yet. And so instead I've sort of found that in some ways people need to see it to believe it. In terms of see collective power to believe collective power. For me in college, because I grew up in very sort of wealthy, don't question the way the world is sort of circles. And it wasn't until in college when I went to my first protest, for instance, which was a very radicalizing thing. After I saw that demonstration of collective power, I could never go back from that. And so I think starting small, I know this happened with, I have to give a shout out to where I went to college. Northwestern University graduate workers just sort of crushed their union election two or 3 weeks ago. But I know that what they did is because I remember talking with people there, they basically waited a very long time to file for a formal election. Part of it is because it was during the Trump years when they were afraid to sort of bring anything before a Trump-appointed NLRB. But they basically became more of a activist sort of space or activist organization to sort of push for very specific issues. Sort of what Trent was talking about with start off by pushing for something like minimum wage, or start off around, okay, find an issue that will affect people regardless of their class consciousness. In academia, the classic one is bullying or abusive supervisors or something. And sort of start small and sort of build this momentum of demonstrating that by organizing around an issue, even if you're not negotiating a contract yet, exercising collective power at any scale yields results. And I think that is really powerful and mobilizing for a lot of people.
Yeah, I wanted to also piggyback off of that a little bit. First, to the online question, which sounds like it's kind of a very concrete, how do I unionize my lab kind of question. I think there's a few really key things that are really daunting when you first start, especially in a science environment where you think everyone has no class consciousness, everyone has no opinions about anything that aren't molecular conformations or something. The thing is the majority of people probably have some grievances and they're not really realizing that there's something they can do about them. So, and instead of, I think, trying to guess what those are and coming to them and being hey, don't you want to raise? You should very literally just invite people out for like a drink and become their friend, and also let them complain about their job, right? Like that works wonders. And like building relationships, like Tia was saying, like genuine, like you have to, like they should trust you and things, right? And you should actually trust them. And then like in addition to that though, there's like, I think something that really also needs to be addressed as like a practical organizing thing, which is I think very important in science too, is that there's going to be a fraction of people who are either like reactionaries or they're going to just like legitimately be unorganizable. These people exist, right? I always remember there's one time I was doing like walking through a chemistry lab trying to like get people to sign up, and this one guy just like was very much not interested, and I kept like talking to him, and I was like, but like, don't you want like a raise or something? And he ended up being like, I don't even know how much I get paid. Like, I don't even look at my paycheck. Like, this guy was so privileged, he didn't even know like what anything was, right? And so that was when I was like, okay, this guy's not worth my time, right? So you need to like realize like, there's gonna be some people who are unorganizable, but they're a tiny minority, even though they might be loud. And everyone has some grievances. And it's not like, you can think of this in a manipulative way of like, oh, you need to find what they don't like and you need to like use that to like get them to be radical. But it's like actually the opposite. It's like there's no point in you forming a union just because you like LARPing as Lenin or something. You should form a union because you want to help your coworkers, and you can't help your coworkers if you don't know what like they want, right? So like that's the hard part, is you have to actually talk to all of them. Like, it's going to take so much time, but like that's the important part, right? So anyway, that's my spiel about that. About the confederation and like international organizing, I don't have a lot of thoughts about this, but one thing I've often wondered is, specifically as someone in like physics, we have this like really strange structure, which is well, at least some parts of the field, where you have these like massive international like collaborations, right? Like whatever CERN or LIGO or these big things. And I've always wondered like what unionizing those things could look like, right? Because you have like people, like thousands of people who are like working together on like this one project. And I don't know, they're being funded by like a bunch of different countries, and it's like a really messy like structure, but that could be like a fascinating like thing to watch happen. I don't know. I mean, it could also make it much more difficult because it's because you have like a million bosses because they're all the countries, but but also it would have a lot of publicity, and it might be like extremely like have some really interesting PR, right? So there's that. I don't know about any confederation of independent unions other than like the IWW maybe, in which case yeah, everyone should join that. But
The idea was like you're talking about the power that you get getting with the organized labor, and actually what could you get? Actually, you maybe go for the alternative of some of you are proposing and confederate in this different way of doing business. Because I know the other one is the dead end, but you are going to be
yeah.
even with the union includes maybe the folks.
I guess the one thing I can say to that is before 2020, I thought unionizing over the internet was impossible, right? I used to think that kind of what I just said, like you have to literally go up to people and talk to them in person, and like that's the only way to organize them, which would make confederating really hard. But now I'm pretty convinced that you can actually do a lot of stuff over the interwebs, and so it's very possible that we could do some really novel, interesting types of unionizing, but hopefully the other people on the panel have better knowledge about that than I do.
So I'll just jump in to say that I think, I keep asking myself the question of what are scientists good for? and one of the things, right, is I guess we do research or something like that. And so the thing is that a lot of social movement organizing and groups out there need the skills that we have in terms of research, because there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be gained about like the enemy, B, the system, right? So I think that is like one way in which we can just really easily link to organizations that exist, particularly anti-war ones, anti-imperialist ones, Palestine liberation ones, all of these avenues are just like really intimately, fundamentally linked to the work that we're doing anyway. So they're just like intuitive places to start to really build those community roots. And I also think that it's really important. I don't even know if I'm answering anybody's question at this point, but I was just thinking about the need to center the visions and the leadership of minoritized people. We know how white male-dominated STEM is, and the few of us who aren't that have a lot of burdens placed upon us in terms of like unpaid emotional academic housework, I call it, which, you know, is, for instance, like mentoring students of color who are like, oh my gosh, the one faculty of color, and then they just like flock to you, and then suddenly, like, you know, a lot of your time goes to mentoring them, to writing them letters of recommendation, all of which is unpaid for for unsalaried workers like myself. And that stuff is not appreciated, is not like counted on your CV or whatever, right? It's not a metric of success in academia to do that kind of work, that emotional labor. And so how can workers support, right, the POC among us, the queer folks among us that are, so that, you know, these folks can actually take some sort of like meaningful leadership in the union? Because let's be frank, like those of us who probably need to be in leadership are the ones that are least able to because of all of the demands that are placed upon us that are competing, right, with that. For instance, the most poorly funded workers, PhD students, for instance, are the ones that are least able to do all of the organizing work because they're probably just having to do 5 other jobs, right, in order to try to make more money. And oftentimes that poorly funded student is a person of color, right? So I'm like wondering, are there ways in which we can show up for those colleagues of ours and ask them, how can I support you in you know, opening the space for you to impart a vision for all of us, right, in STEM? Rather than, like, so the question shouldn't be how do I, as a cis white dude, take leadership? No, it's how do I support people who aren't like me, right? Minoritized people to take leadership. How do I listen to their visions and their agendas, right? And support them in whatever way that they need, whether it be to take up some of that emotional, unpaid housework, academic housework as well, so that we are really centering the visions, the experience, and the leadership of minoritized peoples in STEM, much more than we are. I think that is one of the ways in which then we can become much more relevant, right, to the communities that we want to be oriented towards, because then we would be more representative, like our agendas and our visions would be much more representative of those communities. Because let's face it, like our STEM as it is really doesn't, it's disconnected. Right? It's not representative.
Could I speak just super briefly to the Confederation question? So Higher Ed Labor United is a new multi-union coalition that's meant to bring everybody together in higher ed, because there's about 5 million campus workers, according to the best data we have from the Department of Education, and about 1 million are unionized, but across 13 different national unions and then the various independents. And so with that, again, that heavy level of fragmentation, it's very difficult for us to fight the tyranny of the market. Nevertheless, the contracts that are being rebargained right now with the strikes, most of those unions are working under the Higher Ed Labor United umbrella. University of Illinois Chicago United Faculty, UAW Local 2865 and 5810, and then Rutgers AAU PAFT. So it's like, you know, do Google Higher Ed Labor United and get plugged in. We don't want to cast out the unions that are already affiliated with another national union, because that would be sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face. The vast majority of that 1 million unionized are with the big national unions, but the big national unions are not majoritarian higher ed workforces. They have other priorities. UAW is focused on auto, AFT is focused on teachers, SCAU is focused on healthcare. And so we have to build our own confederated structure, our own coalitional structure, and we're trying to do that. We can't do it without your help.
Actually, could I add on to that? The question of like linkages. So I think that we have a very narrow conception of what a scientist is, and one of the things that I think, thinking about how to organize in the labor movement in STEM, it should entail thinking about who makes scientific labor possible, who makes our labor possible. It's the people that cook the food for us in the cafeterias, right, in our workplaces. It's the people who mop the floors in the labs, who take out the trash in the labs. It's even the taxpayers who then, those tax dollars are going into the government grants that are getting funneled, right, into paying us. It's also like the resources that are pillaged from the colonies or from the former colonies and the rest of the global south, right, that then enable us to do all of this work. So just, I think recognizing all of that helps us to think about what sorts of linkages do we need to make, right, to be relevant to the world. And thinking about how like science itself is a socially constructed category, and the boundaries of what science is a political decision, and that those boundaries can change. So for instance, like enslaved peoples were experts in agriculture and midwifery and housekeeping and engineering, but we don't consider them scientists, right, in their own right. And why is that, right? And so just thinking about then like all of the invisible labor that goes into helping us do our work as scientists, right? And then how can strengthening those relationships and those linkages then strengthen all of us? So again, it's thinking beyond ourselves into the systems of support that have helped us to get here. And they need to be part of our organizing too.
So I'll call on people in the order I saw hands go up. Kiara, do you still want to ask your question? Mike. Thank you.
So what I was gonna ask earlier, since y'all are in STEM, well, because I'm not. So since y'all are in STEM, how would you talk to like people who are outside STEM that have the same level of like privilege as y'all? Like how would you talk to them or how would you talk them into like participating in like organizing efforts or actually organizing in their own spaces? Because I'm pretty sure like people outside of STEM. So like how can you bring your experience and like, encourage other like branches of society to do that as well? Like say for example, like in IT or in finance, hedge funds, which is obviously like the heart of capitalism. It's gonna be really hard, but like how would you like talk to them about that, like as a scientist?
I just ignore them.
You had a question?
Yeah.
Mike over here.
Thank you. So I'm in a PhD program at Temple University, and we are organizing for an imminent strike right now. And so my question is coming from just some nitty-gritty, especially those of you who have been on strike. I want to know how do you, given the spectrum of precarity and vulnerability amongst graduate students to be organized, how do you simultaneously create a culture that discourages scabbing while also recognizing and acknowledging the fact that some people they feel like they have too much risk on their shoulders to be able to put their necks out and to be able to, recognize that, because I feel like those two approaching those two things at the same time are contradictory, and that's hard for me to balance right now myself.
I thought I saw a hand go up in the back, but if there's a question online, we can just go with that. Thank you.
Yep, so we have the postdoc union at Columbia took an apolitical stance, refusing to write a letter in support of a direct call for Palestinian workers during Sheikh Jarrah atrocities, as one example. How do members who want to prioritize social justice undo the work that a neoliberal union leadership pushes forward at every juncture?
I think that's probably going to be the last set of questions that we address as we wrap up. So I'll throw it back to the panelists.
So I wanted to first answer your question about the talking to other people of similar. I think, well, it's an interesting question because like I don't go around with like a privilege meter and like knowing exactly who's at like what level, right? But there's like an informal sense in which like this is why this kind of unionizing is important, is just because like if I tell somebody like, oh, I'm a physicist and I think blah, 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 like people will, like certain types of people will just like take you more seriously. They're wrong, but like they will. And so that's just like, just why this kind of work is important, just because you need to have, I mean, I don't know, maybe like Lenin was right that like you need to have the intelligentsia on your side or something, right? Like people will take you seriously. So then how do you like talk to people about this? I mean, the first group of people you like mentioned was like IT or like kind of tech sector people. I mean, there's kind of a natural extension there, which is that like many of them used to be grad students. Many of the fellow grad students that I know at least are going to go do that because they hate academia. And so like there's just kind of this natural continuity of like use the networks you have, use the people you know who are currently working in like tech or whatever. Other like sectors that might be also privileged that you could talk to, I mean, you mentioned like finance and like I think those are not worth, or like we should just like dismantle them, right? Like I don't think it's worth organizing them. But like, yeah, there's all sorts of like technical professional types of people who like we just have more access to through our social networks because we have degrees and because we live in New York City and all that stuff. And so it's kind of just like, I think it's one of those things of, you have to like be really annoying and just be someone who's like constantly just like broadcasting, like radicalizing content at all times. And people will get tired, but also like you'll notice over time, like your different social circles will like respond to that. I don't know. And I also just wanted to say quickly to your question about striking. That's just like that's really hard. And I think, I mean, strike funds do a little bit to like help with that, right? Where like there is support that comes in for, especially for those that need it. One thing that we also did during our strike was set up our own kind of like solidarity fund where like people could pitch in and then we would like distribute the money. And that way it would be like, you know, because the strike fund kind of goes out to everybody, right? Whereas this was distributed in a more like needs-based way. But then there's also like, I think, I mean, and this you have to be really careful with, but I think like if someone is like a single mother of 3 and they're like doing a PhD and they want like support the strike, but they like literally can't, right? You shouldn't like call them a scab, right? That would be shitty. But like, and that boundary is really blurry. But I think you have to like in your organizing be like aware of that. And I mean, the reality is like that's not going to be a large fraction of like your of the people, right? I mean, there are PhD students who are parents, there are PhD students who are very poor, but like by the very nature of like how privileged of a group it is, like the majority of the people who tell you like, oh, I can't afford to go on, they're like, you know, they're making that up. So like it's kind of a, you know, know it when you see it kind of thing. But I think it's important to like not make people feel like if they can't strike that they're gonna be like a pariah, right? Like there's a way to do both, but yeah, they have to have good reason for it, I guess.
Yeah, I just want to like go build on that too, because that is, I think, a really important point to know or to like recognize, and especially again in like science where it's like, you know, all these sort of questions, people are like, oh, am I scabbing by feeding like the mice in my lab or something? It's like all these sorts of crazy questions. But I think like, again, also tying back into what TA was saying, really investing in these relationships and like, you know, in some ways, like the very confrontational. There's like a very confrontational militant like show up with like baseball bats and stuff, which maybe it certainly accomplished things in the 30s, but you know, maybe different times, different cultures. I don't know, but I don't, especially with higher ed, I don't think that's the biggest. I don't think that's the fastest path to building like solidaristic relationships and whatnot. And like at Columbia, I think one of the, you know, there were. I'm proud of our strike. There were definitely things that were weaker, but one of the things I am very proud of is we had people who joined the strike like 4 weeks into it or 5 weeks into it, and because I think you want it to be like less like, what the heck is wrong with you? You're like stabbing all of us in the back. Like you should be ashamed of yourself. I mean, you know, there are people who just are out to stab them back, but also the reality is a lot of people in like STEM and stuff come from privileged backgrounds where they have no awareness of what a union is. This is like their first, like I was saying, this is like their first time witnessing any collective power. And so I think it should be framed more as like, look at this community like of support and solidarity. Look at like how we're fighting for each other. Like you should want to be a part of this. And sort of framing it more as a positive thing, because ultimately it was an overwhelmingly positive experience for me, rather than like focusing on punishing and like people. I mean, there will be people who just undermine the strike no matter what, but again, there's a lot of people, we have to approach it with some level of nuance.
I'd like to answer the question that was on Zoom about how to relate to the union leadership and union bureaucracy. I think the answer is to organize a faction. No, I'm just kidding, but not really. Because, well, what I'm trying to say is that dissent is really, really healthy in a union. And that, you know, the left flank effect, like it works in my experience. Having like a very loud group of rank and file members who want to push the union to the left and to hold the union leadership accountable, right, to the bargaining agenda of the rank and file members, and to not compromise, right? Having their presence there scares the bejesus out of the union leaders, who then have to, you know, speak all of this concessionary language, like, oh yeah, well yeah, I agree with all of this. Like it really forces them, right, to be held accountable to what they think that what the principles are of the rank and filers. And also though, even having this sort of like left flank faction or whatever, like an outsider strategy, if you will, I think that it shouldn't be seen as a competition to the insider strategy or to the moderates. Rather, it's having both together and not undermining one another, because you're still on the same side of the barricades, and you got to remember that the boss is your enemy and not one another. But that does not mean that there should not be a radical presence that becomes a left flanked in the union, that could even be sort of like its own faction in the union. Because in my union, there definitely is a left flank faction, and it has caused the leadership to stick to a promise that the union leadership kept trying to compromise on, which was $7,000 a course for adjuncts. So I know that it works, but what I would urge it be done is to think about it more in terms of how do we coordinate these two strategies, the insider and outsider strategy versus an insider versus outsider strategy. Because there's ways in which you can organize to not undermine one another.
I'll close with this. It's all about thorough organization. To get what you want, you have to build the right structure, whether it's one of solidarity or accountability or trust, or all of them at the same time. Whatever the issue is, you can't get it by yourself. What you can think about is, what am I going to do to bring more people along with me, and have that really hard conversation, and then have a beverage of your choice afterward, and then get up again the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and organize your lab.
In retrospect, it would have been really great to have a little bit more time to hear your closing thoughts, but I think this isn't a conversation that we need to have as a one-off. Like, hopefully there'll be addition 2, given what's happening within higher education, of this book. And as Science for the People, we're happy to fill that gap of, like depoliticize science and like actually question our socio-cultural context, not be mollified with the idea because we do something that we're passionate about, we deserve to be paid peanuts for it. Like, we're here to contest all of that. And as we're talking about strikes, like, I want to really highlight the fact that within 2 weeks, we're going to have an imminent discussion about the same book within Temple University's campus. It's going to be a set of panelists who've contributed to this book as well. And it's organized by TUGSA, which is an organization of graduate student workers within Temple University. Lots of t-shirts with very dedicated commitments all across the room. So if you can make it there, please do tune in virtually if possible. But these panelists are on this table because they want to build relationships. We are an ongoing, persistent organization, so please reach out to Science for the People and continue this conversation outside of this room. And with that, I'm so grateful for how you've responded to the audience questions, for the time that you've made. Like, 2 hours is a big commitment when people are trying to graduate, write dissertations, and do qualifying exams. I'm really appreciative. And for all our comrades at People's Forum, like, we're your biggest fans. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. Thanks for all the support, and we can't wait to be back here again. Thanks all for showing up. Have a good night.
Thank you to Calvin and Vasiki for
Oh yeah.
putting this all together.
Of course.
Thank you.
Anytime.